Euphoria is a dystopian-themed worker placement game designed by Jamie Stegmaier and Alan Stone and published by Stonemaier Games.
In Euphoria, players vie for control of their society with the hopes of building a better future. You can play with 2 to 6 players, and it takes around an hour.
Players start Euphoria by setting up the board and placing the tokens for the 4 commodities and 3 resources next to their gathering areas. The unavailable territory and action tokens are placed according to the number of players, and the progress and minor tokens go at the starts of their tracks. 6 market tiles are drawn and placed face down on the construction sites, and the artifact cards go next to the board.
Each player gets 2 worker dice, 10 authority tokens, a multiplier marker, and 2 player tokens in their color. Their morale token goes to the far left of its track, and their knowledge token goes on the +3 space. Everyone draws an ethical dilemma card, which they keep face down. Finally, each player draws 4 recruit cards and keeps 2. One of these goes face up on the table as a player's active recruit, while the other stays in their hand. Players roll to see who goes first and to determine their workers' starting knowledge, and the game begins.
On their turn, a player can either place an available worker from their supply or retrieve 1 or more workers from the board. Now, the die result on your workers represents their knowledge. If 2 or more workers have the same knowledge, then they can both be placed on the same turn, one after the other. On your turn, you can also use your active recruit's abilities at the times that are specified on their cards.
The board is divided into 4 regions: Euphoria, Subterra, Icarus, and the Wastelands. Each area has a political faction, and the strengths of these political factions are tracked on the allegiance tracks.
Each track has 4 tiers, each of which will provide a bonus to any player with active recruits of that track's faction. The first tier gives you an extra token when you're using your faction's commodity area. The second tier lets you collect bonus resources or artifacts from tunnels or Icarite territory. The third lets you activate recruits of that faction. And the fourth lets you place an authority token on each of your active recruits of that faction.
Most of the game's action spaces are temporary use spaces, which are marked with a hatched border. Now, a worker is placed on a temporary use space and is not removed until it is retrieved or bumped by another worker. If you bump another worker, you place your die on that space, which gives you access to the action there. The bumped worker is returned to its owner and immediately re-rolled and returned to the supply.
Placing a worker on a tunnel lets you advance the minor marker 1 space and collect a resource or artifact after paying the cost that's listed to the left of your action space. Now, the number of artifact cards you can have in your hand is limited by your morale. When the miner reaches the 6th space of the tunnel, then any players with hidden recruits of that tunnel's faction can turn them into active recruits. When it reaches the end, players with active recruits of that faction can use the new commodity space that is revealed.
Artifact markets let you advance that region's allegiance track, or you can spend artifact cards in order to place one of your authority tokens on that region's territory or on one of the markets in that region, as long as it doesn't already have one of your authority tokens.
The worker activation tank lets you gain a new worker for your supply, and you'll also either gain 2 morale or lose 2 knowledge, depending on the commodity that you spent.
There can be any number of workers in the large area associated with a commodity. So you can place a worker there to gain some of that commodity, to adjust one of the allegiance tracks, or to adjust your own knowledge. The actions that you have access to depends on the total value of all of the knowledge of the workers in that space, including the worker that you are going to add.
Each construction site is bordered by 4 special spaces. You can place a worker on one of these spaces by paying the resource that it shows. Once a number of these spaces determined by the number of players are occupied, the tile on the construction site is flipped and slid to the left, which bumps the workers back to their owners and reveals a new action space. Any player who contributed workers to the construction places one of their authority tokens on the new market. Any players that don't have an authority token there will suffer the penalties that are listed on the bottom of the market tile. And these markets can be used to spend commodities or other goods in order to place an authority token on the region's territory.
You can retrieve any number of workers by paying 1 food or 1 bliss and gaining 2 morale. You can also choose to pay nothing and lose 1 morale. Anytime a worker is retrieved, it is immediately re-rolled and added back to your supply. Anytime the die is re-rolled, you'll have to add up the total knowledge of all the dice in your supply and add it to your knowledge score on the knowledge track. If this equals 16 or greater, then your worker with the highest knowledge abandons you and leaves your supply.
If you don't place or retrieve any workers on your turn, then you can resolve your ethical dilemma card, which will let you either gain a new recruit or place an authority token. And the first player to place all 10 of their authority tokens wins the game.
So I really like Euphoria. I really like worker placement games anyway, and this game does a lot of things right. It's a really fantastic game. I liked it from the moment I started playing it, and I'm sure it'll be a game that gets a lot of play at my house. So one of the great things about this game is you've got a lot of replayability here. So the recruit cards, which you're using, and the market cards are random, and so you're going to end up with a different feel every time you play, a different strategy you're probably going to have to take on. You can't do the same thing every time. Also, there's a really nice mechanic here with the dice, because it adds a really interesting element of not only risk, but also real randomness. So you can plan up to a certain point, but then you're just going to have to roll the dice and see if it works, which is very nice. One challenge for this game for some people is it's probably at its weakest with 2 players. So if you're the kind of people who really like getting together with your best friend and playing a game, this probably isn't the best game for you. It is certainly stronger when you're playing with a bigger group, and a lot of the strengths definitely come out when you've got a lot of different people at the table.
Now, something that even experienced players, and perhaps especially experienced players, will find challenging about Euphoria is that you can't really play it like a classic worker placement game. There's definitely an engine building element to this, but you can't just treat it like a proper engine builder where you're collecting your resources, you're turning them into the commodities you need, and then you're turning those into the victory points that you need. That element is there, but you can't just run it on its own because there's so much interaction that you're going to end up getting stomped by another player who you've been inadvertently helping. And that can be challenging and a little bit disorienting when you first realize it about halfway through your first game, if you're anything like me. Now that interactivity happens to be my favorite part of Euphoria. You've got the more obvious stuff like the bumping of other players' workers that's really interesting, but my favorite element in terms of interaction is those allegiance tracks. Because there are so many actions on the board that end up advancing them, you really have to be careful because innocuous actions you take, like collecting a resource, may end up advancing somebody else's track and pushing them much closer to victory than you want. And the game is incredibly smart in the way that it brings all of these interactive elements together so that every action you take that feels pretty solitary is actually affecting everybody else on the board. And it's really smart and really engaging. I also have to talk about how this game looks because it is just beautiful. This is probably my favorite worker placement game, and a big part of that does come from the visual design and the theme. Not only is it gorgeous, the colors are so vibrant, there's such a consistent art style, but it's also really cheeky and a little bit dark. You've got the names of the locations like the incinerator of historical accuracy. And there's also some subtler elements like the fact that the people that fly up in the clouds and seem to have everything figured out are called the Icarites. There's a real edge of darkness, there's a real edge of irony and satire to this game, and it's integrated so well into the mechanics themselves with things like the knowledge mechanic that it's a beautifully put together game that is much greater than the sum of its parts.
And I think these bricks are made of poo. They're from the waste tunnels. You build things out of poo.
Well, it is a dystopia.
It's true. Use your poo.